Hi, I'm Paul Stansbury, and I will be your workshop instructor. I am the author of Inversion, Not Your Ordinary Stories, Inversion 2, Creatures, Fairies, and Haints, Oh My, Inversion 3, The Lighter Shades of Grays, and Down by the Creek, Ripples and Reflections. My speculative fiction stories have appeared in a number of print anthologies, as well as a variety of online publications. Previously, I have conducted 3 writing workshops for the Boyle County Public Library. This workshop consists of a video presentation, workshop materials, and 1 online interactive session. At the conclusion of the workshop, our goals are that you will understand how to write a flash fiction or short story and author 1 or more completed stories. To participate in this workshop, you will need access to the internet and word processing capability. If you do not have access at home, access is available at the Boyle County Public Library. Please visit the Boyle County Public Library website at the address on your screen for information on how to download workshop materials and the date of our interactive session. At the conclusion of the workshop, you are invited to submit completed stories as attachments to an email and send to Caleb Conover at the address on your screen for the chance to have your story featured in a library display or shared online. William Sidney Porter, better known as O. Henry, was a late 19th, early 20th century American author whose short stories are known for their wit, wordplay, and clever twist endings. During his extensive career, he wrote nearly 600 stories about life in America. His work includes The Timeless Gift of the Magi and The Ransom of Red Chief. He is quoted as saying, "I'll give you the whole secret to short story writing. Here it is. Rule 1, write stories that please yourself. There is no Rule 2. I hope you will approach this workshop with the same philosophy. And while you will learn such things as the 5 elements of plot conflict and how to format a manuscript, the first and foremost objective of this workshop is for you to enjoy the process of writing and experience the pride and satisfaction associated with creating your own flash or short story. What constitutes a flash or short story? Arlen J. Hansen, professor of English at the University of the Pacific, describes the short story as a brief fictional prose narrative that is shorter than a novel and that usually deals with only a few characters. The short story is usually concerned with a single effect conveyed in only 1 or a few significant episodes or scenes. The form encourages economy of setting, concise narrative, and the omission of a complex plot. The character is disclosed in action and dramatic encounter, but is seldom fully developed. Despite its relatively limited scope, a short story is often judged by its ability to provide a complete or satisfying treatment of its characters and subject. To read the complete article, use the link appearing on your screen. There is no set theme or genre requirement for this workshop. Feel free to write about anything that suits you. So, as I said, stories are comprised of a series of events, referred to as the plot. Conflict generated in conjunction with those events is necessary to make the plot interesting. Conflict is what results when the drives of the characters or external forces interact. Conflict may be internal or external. That is, it may occur within a character's mind or between characters and exterior forces. This concept of conflict first developed in the mid-19th century and was the beginning of the modern short story. Your worksheet entitled 5 Elements of Plot Conflict contains Melissa Volker's explanation of these elements in order as they occur in the story. Please follow along using your worksheet. First is the introduction or exposition. In this element, you introduce the characters and the setting of your story. Most often, it provides a hint of the major conflict of your story. Second is the rising action. In this element, you introduce the problem or conflict central to your story. The action really gets underway here. Here you begin to build excitement and tension. The third is climax. In this element, you come to the turning point of your story. This is where your main character comes to a crossroad between success or failure. Fourth is the falling action. In this element, you present the events that will lead to fully resolve, good or bad, the conflict. Fifth and final is the resolution. In this element, you tie up the loose ends and outcomes are revealed, sometimes pleasing, sometimes disappointing. Very rarely will you find any story, much less your story, is neatly compartmentalized into these 5 elements. Most of the time, one element will bleed into the next. This is normal and tends to provide a smooth progression of events throughout the story. The length of each element may vary from story to story, depending on how you construct the plot. Sometimes, for dramatic effect, you may include flashbacks to provide some missing information you did not want to reveal in the introduction. The important thing is to, in some fashion, incorporate the 5 elements into your story. American author Kate Chopin lived from 1850 to 1904. She published 2 novels and about 100 short stories in the 1890s. Most of her fiction, set in the Deep South, focused on the lives of sensitive, intelligent women. After her death, she was widely recognized as one of the leading writers of her time. In your workshop materials, you will find a story she wrote in 1895 entitled The Story of an Hour. Though written 125 years ago, this story reads as fresh and interesting as if it were written today. I have noted in the left margin where each element of plot conflict begins and ends. Follow along with your 5 elements of conflict worksheet as you listen to The Story of an Hour.
It was her sister Josephine who told her in broken sentences, veiled hints that revealed in half-concealing. Her husband's friend Richards was there too, near her. It was he who had been in the newspaper office when intelligence of the railroad disaster was received, with Brentley Mallard's name leading the list of killed. He had only taken the time to assure himself of its truth by a second telegram and had hastened to forestall any less careful, less tender friend in bearing the sad message. She did not hear the story as many women have heard the same, with a paralyzed inability to accept its significance. She wept at once with sudden, wild abandonment in her sister's arms. When the storm of grief had spent itself, she went away to her room alone. She would have no one follow her. There stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all a-quiver with the new spring life. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. In the street below, a peddler was crying his wares. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west, facing her window. She sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came up into her throat and shook her, as a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. She was young, with a fair, calm face, whose lines bespoke repression and even a certain strength. But now there was a dull stare in her eyes, whose gaze was fixed away off yonder on one of those patches of blue sky. It was not a glance of reflection, but rather indicated a suspension of intelligent thought. There was something coming to her, and she was waiting for it, fearfully. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name. But she felt it, creeping out of the sky, reaching toward her through the sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air. Now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her, and she was striving to beat it back with her will, as powerless as her two white, slender hands would have been. When she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under the breath. Free, free, free. The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes. They stayed keen and bright. Her pulses beat fast, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. She did not stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her. A clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked save with love upon her, fixed and gray and dead. But she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely, and she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. There would be no one to live for during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. And yet she had loved him. Sometimes. Often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession of self-assertion which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? Free, body and soul free, she kept whispering. Josephine was kneeling before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. "Louise, open the door! I beg, open the door! You will make yourself ill! What are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sake, open the door!" "Go away, I'm not making myself ill." No, she was drinking in a very elixir of life through that open window. Her fancy was running riot along those days ahead of her, spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be her own. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. She arose at length and opened the door to her sister's importunities. There was a feverish triumph in her eyes, and she carried herself unwittingly like a goddess of victory. She clasped her sister's waist, and together they descended the stairs. Richards stood waiting for them at the bottom. Someone was opening the front door with a latchkey. It was Brentley Mallard who entered, a little travel-stained, composedly carrying his gripsack and umbrella. He had been far from the scene of the accident and did not even know there had been one. He stood amazed at Josephine's piercing cry, at Richard's quick motion to screen him from the view of his wife. When the doctors came, they said she had died of heart disease, of the joy that kills.
What a great story. Were you able to recognize the 5 elements of plot conflict? If you had difficulty, read the story again. This time, review each plot element before you read the text associated with it. Circle or underline key words, phrases, or sentences that help identify the element. To further help you understand the 5 elements of plot conflict, you may want to try this exercise on one or more of your favorite stories. You may have asked yourself, what is the difference between a flash story and a short story? The only difference is length. Fiction stories are typically classified in the following manner. Flash fiction, 100 to 1,000 words. Short story, 1,000 to 7,500 words. Other classifications include microfiction, up to 100 words. Novelettes, 7,500 to 20,000 words. Novella, 20,000 to 50,000 words. And novel, 50,000 words or more. For this workshop, we will focus on flash and short stories. If you are a novice, I suggest you start out to write a story under 2,000 words. However, remember O. Henry's secret for writing short stories. Write stories that please yourself. Are you ready to start writing your flash or short story? The workshop materials contain a short story worksheet which you may find useful in planning your story. As you can see, the workshop contains a diagram of the 5 elements of plot conflict. Keep these in mind as you plan your story. The worksheet also lists 5 elements with space to make the notes on what you will include in each. You may use this to plan out your story. By no means is it a requirement for this workshop. However, it is a useful tool you may find helpful in developing your story. How do you think Kate Chopin might have filled out the short story worksheet for The Story of an Hour? Your workshop materials includes an example of what it might have looked like. In the introduction, the main characters are listed. You do not need to list incidental characters unless they have significant impact on the plot. The setting and the initial event, the train incident, and the resulting death of the main character's husband are introduced. You need not include a lot of detail. Save that for the story proper. In the rising action, the main character goes off alone to her room, opening herself to assess her fate. In the climax, the main character undergoes a significant change in her outlook on life and her perception of her future, realizing she will be free in body and soul for the rest of her life. In the falling action, the main character, exhilarated at the prospect, triumphantly returns to share it with the other characters. In the resolution, the main character husband returns and she dies of shock. So, we see here how a 960-plus word story is condensed into 162 words. If you decide to use this worksheet, do not try to write your whole story in its entirety on this worksheet. It is intended to assist you in organizing your plot and identifying significant characters, places, and events. More than likely, you will write and rewrite your story a time or two before you are satisfied. Do not feel you are bound by everything you may have written on your worksheet. Story writing is a creative process, and you may think of many changes to your story before you complete the final draft. I also suggest you get feedback from others on your story. I am a member of a writers group and regularly seek feedback on my stories. I have conducted 3 workshops. I have seen all manner of formats used to submit short story manuscripts. These ranged from handwritten works on lined paper to emails to single-space manuscripts. All are fine for your own personal use. However, if you are planning to submit your story to the library, I request you use proper manuscript format. I have always recommended that you use proper manuscript format when writing your story. This will allow you to submit, if you wish, your story for publication. Your workshop materials contains a handy checklist on how to format a short story manuscript. Write your name, address, phone number, and email address in the top left-hand corner of page 1. Include the word count in the top right corner. Always use 12-point Courier font. Always double space. Use 1-inch margins. Include the title of your story and your name 1/2 of the way down the first page. Indent your paragraphs, like in a book. Do not use line breaks, like in a blog. Include a top header with your last name, the abbreviated story title, no more than 3 or 4 words, and a page number in the top right corner beginning on page 2. Use a pound sign to separate any line breaks. Here are some of my suggestions when preparing your manuscript, especially if you're planning to submit your story for publication. Always follow the formatting guidelines established by the publication to which you are submitting your story. Do not use weird fonts. Do not use justified margins. Use a tab to indent paragraphs. Do not space. Presently, most publications will accept manuscripts with Times New Roman. Remember to refer to the publication's formatting guidelines, though. It is rare that a publication will request a hard copy. Always follow the submission guidelines established by the publication to which you are submitting your story. Always include a cover letter with your bio unless prohibited by the publication. Microsoft has a story manuscript format which I use. You may also find the shunned manuscript format on the internet at the address listed on your screen. Now it is time for you to write your story. Check the Boyle County Public Library website for the last date you can submit the final draft of your story. Please join me for the interactive session. Remember to check the library website for dates and instructions on how to participate. I will be available to answer any questions you may have. My email address is paulsstansbury@gmail.com. I encourage you to email me with your comments and questions. I will also be happy to review drafts of your stories if included as attachments. However, please be aware of the last date to submit your story to the library and allow me enough time to read your story and provide a response for you to evaluate. In closing, I would like to share with you this abbreviated version of Elmore Leonard's 10 Rules for Good Writing. This is excerpted from the New York Times article, Easy on the Adverbs, Exclamation Points, and especially Hoop-de-doodle. You will find it in your course materials. I recommend you read the full article. Elmore Leonard started out writing westerns, then turned his talents to crime fiction. One of the most popular and prolific writers of our time, he has written about 24 novels, most of them bestsellers, such as Glitz, Get Shorty, Maximum Bob, and Rum Punch. Unlike most genre writers, however, Leonard is taken seriously by the literary crowd. What's Leonard's secret to being both popular and respectable? Perhaps you'll find some clues in his 10 tips for good writing. 1. Never open a book with weather. 2. Avoid prologues. 3. Never use a verb other than said to carry dialogue. 4. Never use an adverb to modify the verb said, he admonished gravely. 5. Keep your exclamation points under control. You are allowed no more than 2 or 3 per 100,000 words of prose. 6. Never use the words suddenly or all hell broke loose. 7. Use regional dialect pathos sparingly. 8. Avoid detailed descriptions of characters. 9. Don't go into great detail describing places and things. 10. Try to leave out the part that readers tend to skip. The most important rule is the one that sums up the 10. If it sounds like writing, rewrite it. I am looking forward to working with you during this workshop and reading your completed stories. Thanks to the Boyle County Public Library, without whose support and assistance this workshop could not have happened.